How's it going, guys? John the Basic Expert here with another video, and this particular video is one of those videos where I didn't really intend to make. It's one of those things that I assumed was a given, but through making a tweet online, I sort of discovered what I thought wouldn't be a controversial topic turns out to be somewhat controversial, which I shouldn't be surprised by that at this point in the hobby, but here we are. And in particular, I said this tweet here, which was, sometimes I want to publish more modules and dungeon adventures, but the thing that stops me is the idea of restocking the dungeon. That's a big deal to me now as a referee. Sure, I can put gnolls in a room in the dungeon, but what will be in that room when the players come back? I hope refs are versed enough to know to restock, but I don't know if many are. Do you restock your dungeons? And my logic behind it, which I explained later when I quote retweeted myself, was that when I'm making a dungeon, when I'm solo gaming or when I've been running multiple groups, returning to the dungeon, I've been restocking. I've been putting, rooms that were once empty are now no longer empty. Rooms that they cleared out maybe might still be empty, but they also might have a new creature that's moved in. And it sort of made me realize, like, if you're making a module, do people, like when they run a module, do people restock the dungeon module, right? Do they restock it? Do they, there's goblins in this room or in this area of the dungeon and the players have completely wiped them out. So is that area just empty forever now? I have an inkling based on a lot of the replies that I received that some people play this way. And I received a whole sort of diverse array of responses to my question here of, do you restock the dungeons? Some people had very complex answers, spreadsheets, all sorts of things like that, which were really cool, because I'm a big supporter. I'm a big fan of restocking your dungeon. But I also had people say things like, no, it should take like months or years for the dungeon to restock. And to me, that's a real head scratcher because that's just boring from a game aspect. Again, this is a role-playing game. These are games at the end of the day. And for me, I don't want the players to walk in and get too comfortable or familiar with the underworld, with the dungeon. And I think leaving lots of rooms empty gets them to feel very comfortable with it. And I realized this maybe last year, partway through running Palace of the Vampire Queen for my in-person group, which they completed, by the way. It took forever to finish that simple module. I mean, I guess I got my money's worth for like the $5 that PDF was, or however much it cost. But they would go through and they were clearing things out, and it took them like weeks and weeks and weeks. And there's supposedly this vampire queen that lives inside this lair. Should these rooms remain empty, or should they be filled back up with other things? And so I started to restock the dungeon in that, because for a while it was sort of getting ridiculous where they'd get to the entrance of the dungeon after, returning from getting a little further in and then backing back out. They'd get to the dungeon and they'd go, I would just roll for an encounter. That was the first start. Like they wanted to just go straight to the layer, the floor level that they had left off on. And I was like, that doesn't make much sense. And they were cool with it too, obviously, but like we need to check at least for random encounters. But after a few weeks of in-game time, it sort of got to the point where it was like, this dungeon isn't going to be empty like this. And at this point, like the number of times that the party's infiltrated this dungeon, this lair of a vampire queen, like she's going to be on alert. She's going to have new guards in rooms if she has access to these sorts of things. She's going to move her forces around. And so what I started to do is I started to take creatures from other levels in the dungeon and moving them into other parts of the dungeon. And this seemed to work out pretty well, and it made every single delve into the dungeon at least a little bit more entertaining than empty room that we cleared, empty room that we cleared. Oh, here we go. We're back where we left off. And I have to wonder if, based on some of the replies that I see, if people play that way. They play the way of like empty room after empty room that's been cleared, and the dungeon just stays that way. Because again, I had people telling me it takes weeks, it takes years, it takes months. And if the players are continually returning to this place, as is suggested in at least 0E, Gary at least suggests to make 12 layers of a dozen layers of a dungeon in order for it to be a proper dungeon. And at least starting with the first 3. But aiming for like 12, make the first 3 or 4 levels of the dungeon that the players can encounter. And I have to wonder, like, is that what their games are like? And if so, it's no wonder that some of their games are kind of boring. More recently, in my white box campaign for supporters on my channel, which has kind of been off and on, mostly due to me with time and scheduling and things like that, but they've been going back to what was originally a kobold lair. And it's funny, they still call it the kobold lair, but there's no more kobolds in there. They're all dead. But other stuff has moved in, and they ran into things like white apes and werewolves and goblins and thule, ghouls, all kinds of stuff in this place, that's moved in, all generated on random encounters. But one thing that a lot of people levied at me, and I kind of want to address it in this because it's sort of related to zero prep in a lot of ways, is this idea of restocking the dungeon and that the dungeon needs to make sense. And so I want to address that point as well. So let's talk about that. I want to bust out this book again, Mythology by Edith Hamilton, because I think it just so clearly explains to me what is going on in Zero E. So in Zero E, and in a lot of old school games, it's called the Underworld. In those later called the Underdark still, even to this day. And it's this mythical place. It is the mythical underworld. And so let's look at Hades from this book, how she describes it. She says, Hades, Pluto, was the third brother among the Olympians, who drew for his share the underworld and rule over the dead. He was also called Pluto, the god of wealth. Oh, wealth, in the earth, for the precious metals hidden in the earth. The Romans as well as the Greeks called him by this name, but often they translated it into dis, Latin word for rich. He had a far-famed cap or helmet which made whomever wore it invisible. It is rare that he left his dark realm to visit Olympus or the earth. Nor was he urged to do so. He was not a welcome visitor. He was unpitying, inexorable, but just, a terrible, not an evil god. His wife was Persephone, whom he carried away from the earth and made queen of the lower world. He was king of the dead, not death himself, whom the Greeks called Thanatos, and the Romans Orcus, which Orcus obviously makes an appearance in the Underworld in Dungeons and Dragons. So there's a lot of things to draw from this mythology that I think Gary is very clearly drawing from within his works here, within his games, and that is that the underworld, the dungeon, is a spiritual place. It is not just in the ground. And this aligns very clearly with a lot of early mythological views regarding the underworld and what it was. It literally was in the earth. Within the Semitic religions, for instance, ancient Judaism, they believed that Sheol, or the underworld, their version of Hades, was deep underwater and in the earth itself. That's why a lot of the Psalms talk about being underwater and going down to Sheol or in the earth. So this concept is like lost, I think, on a lot of our modern mindsets. And instead, and part of this is because we've abandoned alignment. We've abandoned the law versus chaos alignment in a lot of our games. We no longer consider it. We no longer think of it as relevant to our campaign settings. And thus the dungeon no longer makes sense. What this mythical underworld place is that adventurers are venturing into in search of wealth, as Meredith or Edith Hamilton expresses here, because they understood that gems and gold and precious metals, these sorts of things, come from the earth. Or the ancient peoples understood this concept. This is not just relative to Semitic people or Far East religions or the Mediterranean and the Greek religions and mythology, but even the Basque. In one of my Crusaders Chronicles, issue 2, I talk about like Basque's mythological creatures and deities, and Amalur was a Basque deity. And if you don't know where Basque is, it's like in the northern part of Spain. They have their own unique language that is even before the Latin language. Like, they have the oldest language probably in Europe. Amalur, often referred to as Mother Earth, is a central deity in Basque mythology. In some depictions, she is not just a goddess, but the earth itself. She holds the position of the head deity and is believed to be the source of all life and sustenance. The folklore surrounding Amalur is exceptionally well suited for D&D campaigns. According to the Basque culture, Amalur is associated with the idea of having treasure within her, symbolizing the earth's riches that people have always tried to acquire. Basque traditions included leaving offerings at the entrances of caves. This is like actual Basque tradition. There'd be caves and they'd just like leave offerings there. And in D&D, and in a D&D setting, adventurers about to enter the dungeon in search of gold and glory might adopt a similar practice, leaving a bit of treasure as an offering to the goddess before seeking the wealth hidden within her depths. Legend has it that within her caves lie unimaginable treasures, but humans often struggle to find them. Amalur is a fitting deity for adventurers of all kinds to worship. It is also said that Amalur is the mother of the sun and moon, adding to her significance in the Basque pantheon. Her symbol is the stemless carline thistle, a species of sunflower. So, and then I go on to say like how to gamify this in the issue, but I bring that up because like that is like directly. I don't know if Gary was aware of this deity. Maybe he was. A lot of these guys, they're into historical wargaming and Napoleonics, so they were very well learned and read guys, so they loved this kind of stuff. But as for me, as I've delved into mythology and I've delved into reading stuff, you see these little tidbits, and then I look at D&D and I see that a lot of this stuff just makes sense. It's not this ecology. We want to think of it in these like very modern scientific terms, and that's not what Gary was thinking, and that's not what ancient peoples thought either. There wasn't this ecology. Someone was telling me like, oh, if they clear out the dungeon, the centipedes come first, and then I eventually have bigger and bigger monsters kind of move in over time. And again, that's really neat from like an ecology standpoint that you put that much effort into it, but that's really boring to play through, and that's not in line with the mythology that this game is based on as far as what the dungeon is and where it's located. A lot of people ask like why dungeons need to make sense, and it's like, well, if you're venturing into Hades, if you're venturing into the realm of Orcus, you're not just going underground, you're entering a new realm, a new place. These are portals to spiritual places. They're not just holes in the ground, right? You're going into the underworld. You're going into Hades. You're going into Tartarus. You're going into hell. So these places don't need to make sense. They don't have to make sense. You're in a fantastical medieval fantasy setting, game world, and so trying to apply ecology to the dungeon just, to me, seems wildly inappropriate and not very fun to game, actually. So that's like the first part I wanted to talk about. I think I'm going to make a second part of the video talking about tools. I'll make a second video talking about tools that you can use that are already out there that you can use to restock your dungeons. And we'll dive into a little bit of zero prep as well, because that seems extremely triggering to people, and I don't know why the way I run my games is so particularly triggering to people, but for some reason it is. So I think I'm going to make a second video discussing that. Later this afternoon, I'm going to be talking to Black Lodge Games. Make sure you tune in. We're going to talk to them about their successful Kickstarter, and it should be a good time. So tune in later today, 1 p.m., I believe, Mountain Standard Time. If you want to support the channel, please like, subscribe, share the video. You want to support the channel monetarily, you can do so right here on YouTube. You can do it on Subscribestar or on my Guilded server. Check out my Substack. It has links to all these places on the Substack as well. Link will be in the pinned comment below. Subscribe to the Substack. I try and blog fairly regularly and try and provide insightful things. And that's going to do it for this video, guys. The dungeon doesn't need to make sense. This is a mythical underworld place full of treasure from spiritual beings that live within the earth. That's where all these creatures come from. That's where all these demonic creatures are coming from in your campaign setting. At least that's the implied, I think, the implied the reasoning within the rules. And so we don't need to overthink it. I guarantee you your players are not overthinking it, right? I think a lot of GMs, we want to try and make our worlds make sense. We want to try and overlay them and have an explanation for everything. And your players literally do not care. They don't care. They see a hole in the ground that goes to a mythical underworld place full of treasure and monsters. That sounds kick-ass. Let's go there. So that's going to do it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for the next video when that arrives. And again, tune in later this afternoon for a live stream with Black Lodge Games. I'm John. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.